The universe was full of noise, but most of it meant nothing. Static from dying stars, the hum of pulsars spinning in the dark, the faint echoes of civilizations that had gone quiet a million years ago. All of it washed over the sensors of the UES Hemingway like rain on a tin roof, and the crew had long since learned to ignore it. But this sound was different. Lieutenant Asha Khoury was the first to notice it, sitting alone in the communications bay during the deep night watch cycle, when the rest of the crew was either sleeping or pretending to sleep. And she almost missed it because the signal was so faint it could have been a ghost, a trick of the background radiation, a dead whisper from a dead corner of space. She ran the frequency through 3 different filters before she believed what she was hearing. It was a voice. Not human, not anything she recognized at first, but a voice all the same. Thin and shaking and layered with harmonics that made the hairs on her arms stand up, because that was what Valthari's speech did to humans. It resonated in a way that felt like music and grief at the same time. She hit the translator, and the words came through broken and looping. "This is Talindra Colony. We are under attack. Our shields are failing. We have no weapons. We have children here. Please, if anyone can hear us, please come. Please." The message repeated itself every 40 seconds. Khoury did not waste time wondering what to do, because there was only one thing to do, and she opened a direct channel to the captain's quarters, and said 2 words that would change everything. Distress signal. Captain Rena Vasquez was on the bridge in under 3 minutes, her hair still damp and her boots unlaced, and she stood behind Khoury's chair and listened to the full loop of the message twice, without speaking, and every person on the bridge watched her face and saw something settle behind her eyes. Not yet, but something harder than anger, something older. "Origin," she said. "Talindra system, Scutum Centaurus arm, approximately 19 light-years from our current position," Khoury answered. "Who is attacking them?" "Unknown, Captain. The signal does not identify the aggressor, but based on the weapon signatures described in the secondary data burst, Tactical is running a match now." The match came back in less than a minute. Kreth Dominion. The bridge went quiet in a way that had weight to it, because everyone on that ship knew what the Kreth were. Slavers, conquerors, a species that had built their entire civilization on the broken backs of others, operating from the outer rim where the Galactic Concord pretended not to look, because looking would mean doing something about it, and doing something was expensive and messy and politically complicated. Vasquez turned to her executive officer, Commander David Osei, a tall man with calm hands, and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when everything was falling apart around him. "What does protocol say?" she asked, though she already knew. "Protocol says we report to the Galactic Concord Council and await authorization before entering any active conflict zone," he said, "especially given our status as a restricted deployment species." Restricted deployment species, that was the polite way of saying the rest of the galaxy did not trust humans with weapons near other people's problems. Because humans came from a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, and the survivors were the ones who fought the hardest. And that made the other species nervous in a way they never quite managed to hide. Vasquez looked at the signal readout one more time. "Send the request to the council," she said. "Full emergency priority." The response came back 4 hours later, which was actually fast for the Concord, and it said exactly what everyone expected it to say. "The matter is under review. Maintain your position. Do not engage. Further instructions will follow." Vasquez read it once, and then she did something that was technically a violation of 6 different Concord regulations. She forwarded the entire signal package, unedited and unfiltered, directly to Earth Command. Admiral Kofi Asante received the transmission in his office on the orbital station above Nairobi, a room that was deliberately plain because he was a man who did not believe in decoration when there was work to be done. and he sat in his chair and played the Veltari distress call from beginning to end, while the lights of Earth turned slowly in the window behind him. He played it a second time. Then he leaned forward and opened a channel to Captain Vasquez. "How long do they have?" he asked, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made people pay very close attention. "Days," she said, "maybe less. The secondary data shows orbital bombardment patterns consistent with a softening campaign. Once the shields go down completely, the Kreth will begin surface operations. And after that—" She did not finish the sentence because she did not need to, because they both knew what the Kreth did after that. The processing, the sorting, the loading of living beings into cargo holds like freight, families separated, children taken, entire populations fed into a machine that turned people into products. Asante closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, he was no longer the patient administrator that Concord thought he was. He was the thing that Earth had made him, the thing that a billion years of survival on a world that never stopped trying to kill its children had shaped. He was a human being who had just been told that someone who once showed his people kindness was screaming for help in the dark. He began making calls. The first call went to the 2nd Fleet stationed at Proxima, the second to the Marine Corps Rapid Deployment Command on Mars, the third to the shipyards at Ceres, where mothballed warships sat waiting in the cold vacuum like sleeping wolves. Within an hour, the word had spread through channels both official and unofficial, through encrypted military networks, and through the whispered conversations of old soldiers in bars and retired pilots in their homes, and engineers who had kept their toolkits ready for exactly this kind of moment. The word was simple: Talindra. And across human space, in shipyards and barracks and quiet apartments on quiet worlds, people who had been told their whole lives that they were too dangerous, too aggressive, too much for this galaxy, those people stood up and reached for their boots, because someone was calling for help. And humans always answered. The mobilization happened faster than anyone expected, faster than the Concorde thought possible, faster than even Admiral Asante had planned for. And that was because the military was only half of it. The other half was everyone else. On Mars, Sergeant First Class Tomás Herrera was 3 beers into a quiet evening at a bar called the Red Dust when his communicator buzzed with a recall order, and he looked at it and put his drink down and was out the door before the foam had settled. And 17 other soldiers in that same bar did the exact same thing within the next 2 minutes, without a single word spoken between them, because they all saw the same word on their screens, and they all knew what it meant. On Ceres, Chief Engineer Priya Nair walked into the mothball yard where decommissioned warships floated in rows like metal tombstones, and she put her hand on the hull of the UES Achilles and said, "Wake up, old girl." And then she called her team, and they worked for 36 straight hours, pulling systems online, and loading ammunition, and running diagnostics on engines that had not fired in a decade. And when someone from the Concorde Oversight Board sent a message asking why a supposedly deactivated warship was showing active power signatures, Priya did not respond because she was busy and she did not care. On Earth, in a small apartment in Buenos Aires, a retired pilot named Gabriel Mwangi received a one-word message from a friend who still had connections, Talindra, and he sat very still for a long time, looking at the word on his screen, and then he stood up and opened the closet where he kept his flight suit, and he put it on, and it still fit, and he walked out of his apartment, and caught a shuttle to the nearest orbital station, and he did not look back. This was happening everywhere. Civilian cargo haulers volunteered to run supply lines, medical ships diverted from routine routes, communication specialists offered to set up relay networks, and a group of retired intelligence officers who called themselves the Grey Wolves sent Admiral Asante a detailed analysis of Kreth fleet patterns and defensive weaknesses that was so thorough he briefly wondered if they had ever actually retired at all. The Concorde noticed. They noticed because it was impossible not to notice. Human ships were moving in numbers that the galaxy had not seen since the Unification Wars a century ago, and the sensor networks that monitored human space began lighting up like festival lanterns, and within hours, the Galactic Concord Council demanded answers. Ambassador Lian Chu was the one who had to provide them. She stood in the great circular chamber of the Council on Station Meridian, a structure so large it had its own weather systems, surrounded by representatives of 47 spacefaring species, most of whom were looking at her with expressions that ranged from concern to outright hostility. Delegate spoke first, his forearms folded in the gesture that meant formal disapproval among his kind. Ambassador Chu, the Council has observed a significant and unauthorized mobilization of human military assets across multiple sectors. We demand an immediate explanation and an immediate stand-down order. Lian Chu was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, and she had been a diplomat for 40 years, which meant she had spent 40 years being underestimated by species who confused quietness with weakness. The human government is responding to a verified distress signal from the Velthari colony of Talindra, she said, her voice carrying perfectly in the chamber's acoustics. A colony of approximately 4 million civilians, currently under assault by forces of the Kreth Dominion, a known hostile entity engaged in the illegal practice of mass enslavement. That matter is under review, the Torvan representative said. Creature like a tall, thin insect, with prismatic eyes that reflected the light in cold patterns. Under review, Lean repeated, and she let those two words sit in the air for a moment. 4 million people are being bombed and enslaved, and this council's response is that the matter is under review. There are procedures, the Rathani said. There are children in those shelters, Lean said, and her voice did not rise, but something in it shifted in a way that made several delegates lean back slightly in their seats. I have listened to the distress recording, councilors. I have heard Velthari mothers begging for someone to save their families, and I will not stand here and discuss procedures while they die waiting for this council to finish its review. She activated her datapad and projected a legal document into the center of the chamber. Article 7 of the Founding Charter of the Galactic Concord, a clause so old most delegates had never actually read. It, Tale 7, Section 3. Any member species may take unilateral action to preserve sapient life in the event of imminent and catastrophic threat, when the Council is unable or unwilling to act in a timely manner, she read. Humanity is invoking this clause, effective immediately. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted. Translators struggled to keep up, and the Torvan representative called it an act of aggression, disguised as charity. And a Falesi diplomat quietly left the chamber to send a private message to her government, recommending they say nothing and watch what happened. In the chaos, a single delegate approached Lian as she gathered her things. Ambassador Vacian of the Velthari, a tall, luminous being whose skin pulsed with soft blue light that humans had always found beautiful. Ambassador Chu, Vacian said, and his voice trembled with the harmonic resonance of deep emotion. I have been instructed by my government to formally request that humanity cease its mobilization, as it may provoke further aggression. He paused. I have also been instructed, privately, by the families of those on Talindra, to tell you something else. What is that? Lian asked. Hurry. Lian nodded once and walked out of the chamber. 3 hours later, Task Force Hemingway, 27 warships, 12 support vessels, 6 marine transports, and over 15,000 personnel jumped to faster-than-light speed on a direct course for the Talindra system. On the bridge of the flagship UES Mandela, Admiral Asante stood with his hands behind his back and watched the stars stretch into lines as the fleet entered the jump corridor. And beside him, Captain Vasquez was already reviewing tactical scenarios on her datapad because she had transferred from the Hemingway to lead the Vanguard Assault Group. The Concorde will not forgive this easily, Vasquez said without looking up. No. Agreed. But, if we fail, then we fail having done the right thing, and that is a better fate than succeeding at doing nothing. Far ahead of them, in the Talindra system, the Kreth Dominion fleet hung in orbit like a ring of iron around a wounded world, and the war commander aboard the flagship subjugator received a report that a human fleet was inbound, and he pulled up the Concord database entry on humanity and read it carefully, and then he dismissed it with a flick of his clawed hand. Minor species, restricted military capacity, no significant combat record against a real opponent. He returned his attention to the slave processing schedules and thought nothing more of it. That was his first mistake. Task Force Hemingway dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Talindra system, and for a long moment, nobody spoke, because the sight that greeted them was worse than anything the intelligence reports had suggested. The planet hung in space like a bruised fruit, its surface scarred with the black smears of orbital bombardment, and around it the Kreth fleet formed a dense ring of warships and orbital platforms. Over 40 combat vessels, a dozen weapons platforms, multiple troop transports on the surface, and Captain, they have interdiction fields running. They do not want anyone leaving this system. Vasquez studied the display and felt the familiar, cold clarity that settled over her mind before combat. The thing that her instructors at the academy had called tactical focus, and that she privately called the quiet place. The space inside her head where fear existed, but did not control anything. "Admiral," she said over the command channel, "they have us outnumbered roughly 2-to-1 in hulls, and 3-to-1 in tonnage." Asante's voice came back steady as stone. "I can count, Captain. What I want to know is whether you can break that line." "Yes, sir." Then we proceed. The Kreth war commander, whose name was Thraxus, and who had conquered 11 worlds and never once faced a serious challenge, opened a communication channel before the humans could fire a single shot. His image appeared on every human bridge, a massive figure, covered in plates of dark chitin, with 4 arms and eyes like polished obsidian, seated on a command throne, surrounded by officers who watched the human fleet with what could only be described as amusement. "Unidentified vessels," Thraxus said through the translator, his voice carrying the deep vibration of Kreth's speech. "You have entered a Dominion operations zone. This system and its contents are now property of the Kreth Dominion. You will withdraw immediately, or you will be destroyed. This is not a negotiation." There was a pause. Then Captain Vasquez's voice came through on the open channel, calm and clear, and carrying no emotion at all, except absolute certainty. "Kreth Commander, this is Captain Rena Vasquez of the United Earth Navy. We are here for the people of Talindra. You will release all captives and withdraw from this system, or we will remove you from it. This is also not a negotiation." Thraxus stared at the screen for 3 full seconds, and then he did something that his officers had never seen him do. He laughed. A deep grinding sound like rocks being crushed together. "Remove us," he repeated. "You have 27 ships, and you threaten me. What species are you that you are this stupid?" Vasquez said, "We are human, and we are done talking." She cut the channel. Thraxus stopped laughing and gave the order to fire. The first Kreth volley was devastating in the way that overwhelming force is always devastating. Hundreds of plasma lances and kinetic rounds screaming across the void toward the human fleet in a wall of light and metal that should have shattered them in the opening seconds. But the human ships were not where the Kreth expected them to be. In the 3 seconds between the end of the communication and the first volley, Vasquez had already given the scatter order, and human ships did something that Concord species almost never did. They broke formation, splitting into small groups of 3 and 4, that jinked and weaved through the incoming fire, with a recklessness that looked like madness, but was actually the product of thousands of hours of training in exactly this kind of fight. Because humans had always trained for the fight where they were outnumbered and outgunned, because that was the fight they expected. The Kreth first volley hit empty space and half-charged shields and decoys that the electronic warfare teams had deployed in the opening seconds. And before the Kreth gunners could recalibrate, the human ships hit back. Not with brute force. Humans did not have brute force to spare, but with precision that bordered on surgical. The first targets were the Kreth sensor arrays. 12 missiles, 12 hits, and suddenly the Kreth fleet was half blind, their targeting systems scrambling to compensate as jamming signals flooded every frequency the humans could reach. And in the confusion, 3 flights of human gunships, small, fast, practically invisible against the backdrop of battle, slipped through gaps in the orbital defense grid and began attacking the weapons platforms from angles the Kreth had not thought to defend, because no sane species would fly that close to an active weapons platform. Human pilots were not known for being sane by galactic standards. But the real shock came when the marine transports pushed forward under cover of the chaos and began launching boarding pods directly at Kreth warships. Boarding actions, actual physical combat inside an enemy vessel, had not been a standard military tactic in the galaxy for over 1,000 years, because it was considered barbaric and wasteful, and frankly, insane. And the Kreth had no protocols for it, because why would they? Nobody did that anymore. The humans did that. Marine teams in powered armor cut through Kreth hull plating and poured into the corridors of 3 enemy destroyers simultaneously. And what happened inside those ships would later become the subject of horrified discussion across the Concord, because the Kreth were large and strong and covered in natural armor, and they had claws that could tear through metal. And it did not matter. The humans fought in the tight spaces like they had been born for it, because in a sense they had. Their species had evolved in caves and forests and cities where close combat was not an abstraction, but a daily reality. And every Marine in those corridors carried 10,000 generations of survival instinct in their blood and bones. 2 of the 3 destroyers were captured in under 20 minutes. On the surface of Talindra, in a shelter beneath the ruins of what had once been a beautiful city of crystal and light, an elder named Celeris pressed her luminous hands against the trembling walls and felt the vibrations of the battle above. And she did not know what was happening, but she knew that the rhythm of the bombardment had changed. It had stopped being one-sided. She gathered the children closer and whispered to them in the soft, harmonic language of her people. Fighting for us. Above her, the sky was full of fire and falling metal. And through it all, human drop pods began to streak downward like burning seeds. Each one carrying a squad of Marines, heading for the surface at speeds that would kill any species that had not evolved on a world where gravity was a constant enemy. The Kreth ground forces looked up and saw them coming, and for the first time, something that might have been doubt crossed their faces. Thraxus watched from the bridge of the subjugator as his tactical display filled with warning indicators and damage reports, and he realized with a cold shock that these humans were not fighting like any species he had ever encountered. They were not following patterns. They were not using standard formations. They were adapting in real time with a speed and creativity that his officers could not predict. He had lost 9 ships in the first hour. He had never lost 9 ships in an entire campaign. The order that he had never given before: pull the fleet back to a tighter defensive position around the planet, and send a priority message to the Dominion core worlds. Send reinforcements, he said, and for the first time his voice carried something that his officers did not recognize, because they had never heard it from him before. It was uncertainty, and in the space between the fleets, floating among the debris and the silence between explosions, the distress signal from Talindra was still broadcasting on its endless loop. But now there was a new signal beside it, a human military beacon, strong and clear and repeating a simple message to anyone who could hear it. We are here. Hold on. We are here. The battle for Talindra did not end in a single day, because real wars never do. And what had begun as a rescue mission became a siege that ground on for 6 terrible days, while the galaxy watched and held its breath. On the first day, the humans had surprise and fury on their side, and they used both to devastating effect. But by the second day, the Kreth reinforcements began arriving. First a squadron of heavy cruisers from a nearby system, then a full battle group from the Dominion's inner territories, and suddenly the numbers that had been bad for the humans became much worse. By the 4th day, Task Force Hemingway had lost 8 ships destroyed, and nearly every surviving vessel was damaged in some way. And the UES Hemingway itself, the little patrol frigate that had first heard the distress signal, took a direct hit from a Kreth siege cannon that tore through its port side and killed 37 crew members in a single flash of superheated metal. Fire. Captain Vasquez was on the Hemingway when it happened. She survived because she was on the bridge and the bridge held, but she felt the ship shudder and groan around her, like a living thing in pain, and when the damage reports came in she stood very still for 5 seconds, and then she ordered the surviving crew to evacuate to the assault carrier Shaka, and she was the last one off the Hemingway, walking through corridors that were half dark and full of smoke, stepping over debris and around the places where the hull had buckled inward, like a crushed can. She transferred her command to the Shaka, and she did not pause, and she did not grieve, not yet, because there was no time for grief when people were still counting on her. On the surface, the situation was both better and worse than anyone had expected. Better because the human Marines had established a defensive perimeter around the largest cluster of Velthari shelters, and they were holding it with the weather. Kind of stubborn ferocity that made the Kreth ground commanders genuinely confused, because by every tactical calculation, the humans should have pulled back to more defensible positions hours ago. Worse, because the Velthari were in terrible condition. Weeks of bombardment had destroyed their food supplies and medical facilities. The shelters were overcrowded, and the air filtration systems were failing. And the children were the worst off, because Velthari young were fragile in ways that human children were not, their bioluminescence flickering and fading when they were scared or sick or hungry. Sergeant Tomas Herrera, the same man who had put down his beer on Mars and come running, was part of the Marine unit holding the eastern perimeter. And on the 3rd night of the ground siege, he found a Velthari child sitting alone in the rubble of what had been a garden. Her light so dim she was almost invisible, and she was shaking in a way that had no sound. Next to her, and he did not speak because he did not know her language, and the field translator was glitching from all the electromagnetic interference. So instead, he took off his armored glove and held out his bare hand and waited. The child looked at his hand, thick and scarred and covered in dirt and dried blood, and she looked at his face, and she must have seen something there that transcended species, because she reached out and wrapped her small luminous fingers around his, and her light pulsed once, faintly, like a candle trying to stay lit in a storm. Herrera picked her up and carried her back to the shelter on his hip, and he did not put her down until he found Solaris and placed the child gently in the elder's arms. "Found her in the eastern ruins," he said. Solaris looked at this human, this creature from a death world, covered in armor and weapons, smelling of smoke and sweat and violets, and she saw that his eyes were wet. She said, through the translator, and it was not an insult. It was wonder. "Yeah," Herrera said, "we get that a lot." He went back to the perimeter, and 30 minutes later he took a plasma burn across his left shoulder that melted through his armor and scorched the skin underneath. And he kept fighting, because the line could not afford to lose a single defender. And when a Velthari medic tried to treat him during a lull in the fighting, he waved her off and pointed to the wounded Velthari behind him. "Them first," he said. Back in orbit, the situation reached its crisis point, on the 5th day, when Thraxis, growing desperate and furious at the failure of his forces to crush this tiny human fleet, ordered a broadcast on all channels showing Velthari prisoners being marched toward execution platforms on the far side of the planet. A clear message that if the humans did not withdraw, the hostages would die. He expected this to break them. He did not understand humans at all. Admiral Asante watched the broadcast on the bridge of the Mandela with an expression that the crew would later describe as terrifyingly calm. And when it ended, he turned to his tactical officer and said 4 words. "Bring me Plan 17. Plan 17 was a maneuver that human war colleges taught as a theoretical exercise, because it was considered too dangerous for actual use. A synchronized micro-jump, where multiple ships would execute a faster-than-light hop of such short distance that they would effectively teleport from one position to another within the same star system, emerging at point-blank range inside an enemy formation. The margin for error was measured in milliseconds. A ship that dropped out of FTL too early would slam into another vessel at a fraction of light speed. A ship that dropped out too late would overshoot into the planet itself. And the navigational calculations required were so complex, considered it theoretically impossible. "Sir," the navigation officer said, and there was fear in her voice, but also something else, something that sounded almost eager. "We can do it. The math is tight, but we can do it." "Then do it," Asante said. 12 human warships jumped simultaneously. They vanished from the Kreth sensors for exactly 1.3 seconds, and then they reappeared inside the Kreth defensive perimeter, so close to the enemy ships that the gunners could see the hull markings with their bare eyes. And in that moment of absolute shock and confusion, the human ships opened fire with everything they had at ranges so short they could not miss. The effect was catastrophic. Kreth ships that had been positioned to defend against long-range attack were suddenly being hit from every direction at once. Their formations shattered, their communications jammed, their commanders screaming orders that nobody could hear over the electronic warfare. Assault that accompanied the jump. 6 Kreth warships were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. The orbital weapons platforms, designed to target enemies at distance, could not depress their guns fast enough to hit ships that were practically underneath them. And human boarding teams launched again, swarming 2 more platforms and capturing them intact and turning their weapons against the remaining Kreth vessels. On the ground, the Marines received the signal they had been waiting for. The Kreth orbital support was broken, and they launched a full assault on the detention complex where the hostages were being held. The fighting was room to room and corridor to corridor, and it was the ugliest kind of combat that existed, close and brutal and loud. And the Marines paid for every meter in blood and sweat, but they did not stop and they did not slow down, because behind those doors were people who needed them. Sergeant Herrera was the first through the door of the main holding chamber. His shoulder still burned and his armor cracked in 3 places. And what he saw inside, hundreds of Velthari packed together in the dark, their light almost gone, their eyes wide with terror. What he saw broke something inside him and rebuilt it into something harder. "We are here," he said, and his voice cracked but his hands were steady. "We are human and we are here, and nobody is going to hurt you again." Above the planet, Thraxus watched his fleet come apart around him, and he sat on his command throne, and felt something he had never felt in his entire career of conquest and subjugation. He felt defeated. He reached for the communications panel, and for the first time in the history of the Kreth Dominion, a war commander transmitted a surrender signal. But even as his transmission went out, even as the guns slowly fell silent, and the burning wreckage of dozens of ships tumbled through the orbit of Talindra, a deeper silence was spreading from the Dominion core worlds. No response to his calls for help. No acknowledgement of his surrender. Just silence. And silence from the Dominion did not mean peace. It meant they were thinking. It meant they were planning. And it meant that what had happened at Talindra was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The silence after battle was always the hardest part. When the last Kreth ship powered down its weapons, and the surrender signal pulsed across the system on every frequency, the crew of the UES Mandela did not cheer, because there was nothing to cheer about. Not yet. Not when the cost was still being counted in names and empty bunks, and ships that would never fly again. Task Force Hemingway had come to Talindra with 27 warships and over 15,000 souls. 8 ships were gone, not damaged, not repairable, but gone, reduced to expanding clouds of metal and memory scattered across the orbital plane. 1,143 humans were dead. Admiral Kofi Asante read the casualty list in his quarters alone, every name, and when he was finished, he sat in the dark for a long time, with the lights of the burning debris field drifting past his window like slow and terrible stars. Then he washed his face, put on a clean uniform, and took a shuttle down to the surface, because there were people who needed to see that someone was in charge and that what they had suffered and sacrificed had not been wasted. Talindra from orbit had looked wounded, but from the ground it looked gutted. The crystal spires that the Velthari were famous for had been shattered into glittering fields of broken glass. The gardens that had once covered entire districts were scorched black, and the air tasted like ash and ozone and something chemical that the human medics said was Kreth weapons residue. But amid the devastation, there were signs of life. Velthari were emerging from the shelters, blinking in the harsh light, their bioluminescence slowly returning as they realized that the bombardment had stopped, and the Kreth soldiers were gone, and something impossible had happened. Someone had come for them. The reunions were quiet in the way that profound relief is always quiet. Not the absence of emotion, but the overwhelming presence of so much emotion that sound could not contain it. And human Marines who had fought for 6 days straight stood at their posts and watched families find each other, and said nothing, because some things did not need words. Soluris found Asante near the ruins of what had been Talindra's central library, a building that had held the collected art and history of her people for 300 years and was now nothing but a skeleton of twisted metal and shattered crystal. She walked toward him slowly, this tall, quiet human with gray in his hair and grief in his eyes, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at his face. "You are the one who sent them," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes," he said. "Why?" It was such a simple question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Because you asked," he said, "and because a long time ago, when my people first came to the stars, your people were the ones who welcomed us. Monsters or dangerous animals. You treated us like neighbors, and we remember that." Soluris was quiet for a moment, and then she raised her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart, and her skin pulsed with a deep warm light that humans had no word for, because it existed in a spectrum their eyes could barely perceive, but their bodies could feel. A warmth that settled into the bones and stayed there. "This is Kethala," she said. "It means you are known to us forever. Your name, and the names of everyone who came here, will be woven into our memory light, and they will never fade." Asante, who had held his composure through a 6-day battle and the loss of over 1,000 people under his command, had to look away for a moment and blink several times before he could speak again. "That is more than we deserve," he said. "No," Soluris said, "it is less." In the Galactic Concord Council chamber, the aftermath of Talindra detonated like a Denny's. Second battle, political this time, but no less vicious. The Torvon delegation formally moved to censure humanity for unauthorized military action, and demanded reparations to the Kreth Dominion for destroyed assets. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the motion might carry. because many species were frightened by what they had seen. Not just the human military capability, but the speed and ferocity and absolute willingness to sustain casualties that had shocked every military analyst in the Concord. Ambassador Lian Chu stood in the center of the chamber and waited for the shouting to stop. And then she began speaking in a voice that was quiet and precise and carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Before this council votes on censure," she said, "I would like to present evidence that my government has obtained from captured Kreth vessels and communication systems." She activated her datapad, and the chamber filled with projections, financial records, communication logs, and at the center of it all, a web of transactions that traced the flow of Kreth slave labor into the economies of 6 Concord member species, including the Torvan. The chamber went very still. The Kreth Dominion has been operating a slave trade under this council's authority for over 30 years, Lian said, and 6 member species have been purchasing the products of that trade while publicly condemning it. The reason this council's review took so long was not bureaucratic delay. It was deliberate obstruction by delegations that profited from the suffering of others. The Torvan delegates' forearms uncrossed very slowly. "These allegations are documented," Lian said, "thoroughly." The censure motion collapsed within the hour, as delegations scrambled to distance themselves from the exposed trade networks. And in the chaos, 3 species, the Velthari, the Falesi, and the Rathani, resolution recognizing humanity's action at Talindra as a legitimate humanitarian intervention, and calling for an investigation into Concord complicity in the slave trade. It passed by a narrow margin. Humanity was not expelled from the Concord, and something shifted in the galactic order that day. Not a dramatic revolution, but a quiet realignment, like tectonic plates settling into a new position. And the species that had spent a century treating humans as dangerous curiosities began to see them differently. Not as safe, or comfortable, or easy to be around, but as something the galaxy might actually need. The Kreth Dominion sent their response 3 weeks later. A formal diplomatic communique, delivered through neutral channels, demanding reparations for their losses at Talindra, and threatening, in language that left no room for interpretation, total war against human space if their demands were not met. Admiral Asante was given the honor of drafting humanity's response, and he spent less than 5 minutes on it. The message was broadcast on every open channel in the galaxy, unencrypted, for everyone to hear. "To the Kreth Dominion, we know where you are, and if you touch another species under our protection, we will come to your worlds, and we will not stop." The Dominion did not reply. Their border fleets, which had been massing for a retaliatory strike, quietly withdrew to defensive positions and stayed there. And the slave ships that had been operating in the frontier systems changed course and went home. Not because the Kreth had become peaceful or merciful or good, but because they had learned something that the rest of the galaxy was still processing. That the humans meant exactly what they said, every word, and that the cost of testing that promise was higher than any prize was worth. 6 months later, Talindra was still broken, but it was healing. Human engineers worked alongside Veltari builders to reconstruct the shelters and water systems and power grids, and they did it with the same intensity they had brought to the fighting, as though the act of building was just another form of combat against the damage that had been done. In the new garden that had been planted where the old library once stood, Velthari children played among the young crystal shoots that were already beginning to grow. And among them were a handful of human children, the sons and daughters of the engineers and aid workers who had come to help rebuild. And they chased each other through the glittering rows and laughed in 2 different languages that somehow sounded the same. Celuris watched them from a bench made of salvaged crystal, and she thought about everything the galaxy had told her people about humans. That they were violent, that they were dangerous, that they came from a world so hostile it should not have produced intelligent life at all, that they were the monsters of a death world unleashed upon the stars. She thought they were right about one thing. Earth had indeed produced something the galaxy had never seen before. Not monsters, guardians. And far away, on worlds that the Concord had forgotten and the Kreth had claimed as property, other species heard what had happened at Talindra. Heard it through smuggled transmissions and whispered stories and the faint echo of a human military beacon that was still broadcasting in the dark. We are here. Hold on. We are here. And for the first time in 1,000 years, in chains and in cages and in the holds of slave ships, they dared to hope, not because salvation was certain, not because freedom was guaranteed, but because somewhere in the vast and indifferent galaxy there was a species that heard a distress signal and answered it with everything they had. The Deathworlders were listening.